And I think a common misconception that Say gets as a network and as an open source blockchain is that it's like a very DeFi focused, kind of finance focused chain. And I'd say the biggest reason for that is most people don't realize how universal the exchange of assets and trading actually is. The DNA of the Say Labs team very much comes from SF in the Bay Area. Engineers, people, founders in the Bay obsess over is what is the actual problem that users and customers are coming across. I think that by and large tends to get lost in Web3, where people get so excited about the technical problem that they forget about the actual user problem. The end customer that matters the most are the developers. And what do developers care about? They care about offering their users of their applications the best user experience. That's the only thing they care about, is acquiring users. You acquire users by offering a great user experience. And that is the only value prop, the only problem that Say needs to solve.
Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I got to talk with your co-founder, Jay, a while back about kind of the technical nuance of what you're building at Say, how it's kind of differentiated from other blockchains. But super excited to speak with you, have the community hear directly from the other half of kind of the Say Foundation and what you guys are ultimately building. Really looking forward to the conversation and ultimately what you guys are building, because I do think it's unique, it's differentiated from other different blockchains in the space. So really excited to have you on.
I'm excited to share kind of the other half of the world. I can speak on behalf of a couple points on the foundation side, but really for where I spend time, it's how do you think about the ecosystem in an intentful way?
Perfect. Well, maybe just before we jump into kind of the community side of things, a little bit more about Say itself. Can you just give the listeners a brief background on how you and Jay met, how Say ultimately came about?
Yeah, in terms of my personal background, I have a pretty sort of run-of-the-mill history. Like born and raised in San Francisco in the Bay Area, and never left. Spent pretty much my entire life there. I had ended up going to school at UC Berkeley. Initially got into crypto really purely because we were desperate to pay tuition. UC Berkeley has way cheaper tuition than most universities if you do in-state. So that was at least the initial reason why I decided to go there, but it wasn't enough. I needed to work some side jobs, figure out ways to pay things off. And at the time, this was back around 2014 timeframe. If you live in the dorms, the electricity is free. So the sort of brilliant idea that we had as kids back then was, well, if you don't pay for electricity, then mining is quite literally kind of a free opportunity. So we had at least gotten started with Litecoin, and that was sort of the first, my first foray into crypto at the time. Then spent a lot, really the majority of my time in university working on startups. So across the board, I think education, healthcare, just trying out a lot of different things. Then coming out of university, spent a bit of time at Goldman. So took companies at Cloudflare public, worked with a lot of really large tech companies, and effectively realized how awful it is to work at a large company, and how much bureaucracy, all the issues. It's basically like you're swimming in mud is how slow things move. Left and quit Goldman to work on my last startup with Jay as well. So Jay is my co-founder. The two of us have worked together on a lot of different things. So we've sort of had that decades built sort of trust in each other. Most recently, before starting Say, I was at a VC called Cotu. So there did a lot of some of the fintech, the software, a bit of the crypto. So invested in companies like OpenSea, Starkware, Dune, Fireblocks, Alchemy, and a lot of good fintech companies as well, like Stripe and a few others.
That's amazing. Yeah. I feel like I've heard the story of kind of mining in your dorm room once before. It seems like a common theme of kind of entrepreneurs trying to find a side hustle, whether kind of mining cryptocurrencies on the university's computers, borrowing their electricity. But amazing to hear that ultimately you kind of were able to, one, kind of go in the corporate world, see how slow things move there. Some of the bureaucracies get a taste of that, but ultimately get up and close on the venture side as well, and especially within Web3 and some of those notable companies that you mentioned, like OpenSea. How was kind of that quick experience on the venture side, did that ultimately lead you into wanting to explore more about the blockchain world? How does that tie into you and Jay deciding to want to build, say, in kind of a new blockchain standard?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's funny you bring up the mining piece. I think it self-selects for like desperate people. And that's very much so the sort of inbuilt culture that you'll find as you get to know more and more people from the Say Labs team is we very much have that underdog mentality. You see a lot of that in some of the best startups in this entire generation, and the best ones maintain that mentality even after they become big, successful, and scaled. So that's something that we care a lot about. To answer the question, your question directly, I'd say in in VC there's two major takeaways. The first is I became very interested in user acquisition, kind of the go to market, how companies build a good product, but more importantly, uh, uh, grow that product amongst users. Because those tend to actually be two completely separate things. There are countless examples of really good products um, that nobody knows about and nobody uses. It's like unfortunately a big travesty, and I think there's no better example than that in crypto. So that's probably the single biggest learning is how important psychology and a good understanding of psychology ends up playing a role in good sales, in good user acquisition. And the cool part about crypto, some of what happens in DeFi is you see those feedback loops play out really fast. So one example is in fintech, a lot of companies focus entirely on user acquisition. How much money does it cost to acquire one user? Because if we get one user using our sort of online bank, it's actually pretty predictable how much value that's going to bring over the 2 3 years that they'll stay with the company. So then the question becomes, how can we acquire that user for as low as possible, as efficiently as we can? When you come up with the user acquisition strategy, it typically takes around a year, 6 months to at least a year to really see that play out. It's like, okay, was that a good idea or not? You'll find out a year from now. In Web3, you find out in like a week. The incentives play out so quickly that okay, a week from now you'll see whether or not the sort of user numbers go up and down. And I think you can see a lot of the current applications that are in crypto and Web3 today. So it's fun in just experimenting because you see that feedback so fast. You can switch things up, you can improve it, and that's why there's so much things going on and change.
And I would definitely echo your sentiments of great technology ultimately doesn't win. You also have to have that distribution piece. I find, especially with early stage companies in crypto on the venture side, often they're doing something extremely novel, or some of it's kind of repeat products. Maybe you add a token, but I would say more so than the tech, the harder part for these teams is really the go to market and the strategy around how to get that distribution. And very few teams, I would say, have been able to really overcome kind of that inertia to hit and test to see if they can kind of get to some amount of product market fit or get enough distribution that enough people are actually testing their product. It is a hard challenge, whether it's in crypto or even Web 2 companies as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and that's something that me and my team spend all day thinking about is how does the foundation go about hiring? How can we support the foundation in the best way possible so that they can really carry the torch on and grow the ecosystem in the right way? What are all the learnings from past ecosystems, kind of the good and the bad? There's so much bad, but that's exactly the kind of the learnings that I think the state team really benefits from.
100%. Well, maybe kind of diving deeper into like the say thesis, what you guys ultimately saw in the market that didn't exist, that you really wanted to go out and build it itself. It's interesting today when I talk with other investors in the space, even application engineers, a lot of them, they're either confused or trying to understand the market as it stands today. They have different options with Ethereum, layer twos. There's kind of a different class of blockchains that are focusing more on high throughput, like Solana, like Sui, Aptos. In your words, where would say kind of uniquely fit in the blockchain landscape, and why is it actually needed in the departure of kind of some of the technical understandings? Why are those needed that cannot kind of be built elsewhere?
Yeah, yeah. So perhaps like the easiest place to start is say only has one very simple thesis, and you'll find that thematically across a lot of how the team approaches building the ecosystem is keep things simple. And I think that's if you look at the best companies point blank in history, there's no need to sort of reinvent the wheel. It's like how have some of the best organizations in the world approached growing the business. Amazon only has one thing that they care about, just the customers. And any sort of Jeff Bezos interview you'll listen to, he'll talk about he'll repeat this one word 15, 20 times. And that's roughly the interview. For say, the only thesis that we have is we believe that the fundamental use case of blockchains is the ability to exchange digital assets. That's it. There's so many other potential use cases that people talk about, like all of the possibilities. We boil all of that down and we say, this is the core use case. That won't change. And I think a common misconception that Say gets as a network and as an open source blockchain is that it's like a very DeFi focused, kind of finance focused chain. And I'd say the biggest reason for that is most people don't realize how universal the exchange of assets and trading actually is. Like when they think trading, they think about all the candles and all of the technical analysis and sort of speculating up and down. Trading is about as general purpose as it gets. It is critical for every single part of any Web3 ecosystem. So you can think NFTs, gaming, social. It all actually comes back to trading. We can kind of dive a lot deeper into that. But that's one of the big differences in terms of both the thesis and what ends up leading to how we think about Say's differentiation as well.
No, I think that's beautiful. And I mean, at Tesla, Elon kind of has this like famous saying that one of the worst traps is optimizing for something that should not exist. And I think it kind of goes to your point, like really boiling things down to like their fundamental primitives. And in that case, with Say, with blockchains, particularly kind of this trading thesis is rather beautiful. And because it's so clear, kind of pinpointed, all that energy really goes to making that use case as eloquent, as simple as possible, and allows application engineers to really go in and figure out the best ways to harness that.
Yeah, no, I think it's very well said. Like the irony of startups and really any new kind of technology like Say is there's ironically only a few things you need to get right, and you can get everything else wrong. You can completely whiff on everything else in the ecosystem, but if you get that one thing right, that matters more than everything else combined. And that is exactly the thesis that the team has around the exchange of assets. So if we take an example of look at every successful app in Web3 today, every single one, by and large, they neatly fall into two simple buckets. They're either directly in exchange,
Yep.
or they're indirectly in exchange in that most of their demand comes from an exchange, or they need to exchange assets. So we can go into each of the buckets. The first bucket that's directly in exchange, it's like Uniswap, Sushi, OpenSea, Magic Eden, and a lot of the games as well. So if you look at Axie and SEPN, people think of them as games, when structurally they're actually exchanges. Like the main thing and the main user experience of StepN and Axie is you exchange the tokens or you exchange the NFTs. So all of that you can categorize as effectively directly in exchange. Like there's actually not much different from Uniswap versus OpenSea. You're exchanging a different token format. One's non-fungible, the other one's fungible.
Yeah, it is rather interesting now looking at kind of the broad applications. They really do. The ones that have truly found product market fit are operating, exchanging value in the back end, and uniquely kind of leveraging the basic property of a ledger that blockchains have created, the digital ledger. It is kind of remarkable.
Yeah.
when you kind of boil it down.
Yeah, no, it gets even more interesting when you dive into the other bucket, the sort of indirect exchanges. So, what are the other really successful applications that consumers use that we haven't mentioned yet? It's like Aave, MetaMask, stablecoins like USDC and Tether. We can go through each one. Aave, most of the demand for Aave comes from the need to buy something. It's like that is the core purpose for taking out a loan is you do something with the assets now, the sort of liquid assets. So it's very fair to say that if you remove Uniswap from the Ethereum ecosystem, most of the demand, the organic demand for Aave, just vaporizes. And Aave needs to then move to wherever Uniswap moves next because so much of that demand comes straight from another app. Same thing with MetaMask. MetaMask and where the users of MetaMask end up is actually pretty easy to back into. All you have to do is just look at the most used apps on Ethereum. And most of the users that go onto MetaMask end up using Uniswap, OpenSea, Blur, or MetaMask Swap. It's like the exact same destination that they all end up at. And then the last part, stablecoins. People talk about stablecoins a lot because they're one of the few products that have that deep product market fit. But guess what stablecoins are used for? For liquidity as a trading pair. It's like USDT shows up as the default pair for most assets on centralized exchanges, on DEXs as well. So all of it ends up coming back to trading, and that's very evidently why something like Say needs to exist. Is optimizing every part of that stack for exactly the one use case that the entirety of blockchains will end up really convening on.
Yeah. And so you and Jay were ultimately looking at the landscape. You saw some stuff that was going on in Ethereum, saw what was going on kind of in the layer 2 land, Solana, say, or Sui and Aptos. And you're like, look, they're a little bit more general purpose. You can do a lot of things on each of them in their own regard, but they're not specifically focused on the core fundamental primitive, which is trading. And that's why we need to really redesign the tech stack from the ground up and allow the engineers to focus simply on leveraging this primitive.
Perhaps like the easiest way to think about how you talk about the value prop for Say is the DNA of the Say Labs team very much comes from SF in the Bay Area. And one thing that I'd say a lot of engineers, people, founders in the Bay obsess over is what is the actual problem that users and customers are coming across. I think that by and large tends to get lost in Web3, where people get so excited about the technical problem and really solving for this technical feat that hasn't been done before, that people really, really get it. Other engineers and developers get really excited about. And they tend to index so heavily on solving the technical problem that they forget about the actual user problem that people care about. I'd say that's one of the biggest differences for the value prop of Say is when you think about the only problem that Say focuses on solving, it's how do you facilitate the exchange of assets? How do you make that as smooth as possible? And one way of thinking about the problem is if Say is successful, then a decentralized exchange has no trade-off, next to no trade-off. There will always technically be a small sliver because running an application on more than one database is going to operate a little worse than if you ran on just one database. But how do we cut that trade-off as much as possible? And at the end of the day, that reflects in the user experience. Using Coinbase, for example, is so much more smooth than using any decentralized exchange. It is night and day. And that's why something we ended up starting something like Say is because if you can build a DEX right now on Ethereum or on any other L1 and L2, the only problem is the DEX will operate so much worse than Coinbase or pick any other centralized exchange. It's not even worth competing. It's like you can try your best, you can come up with new mechanisms. It actually doesn't matter. The user experience is it is completely different in a different league. So how do we narrow that as much as we can?
Being able to send money peer to peer, and then with Ethereum kind of expanding upon that with smart contracts, a whole new kind of world opened up. But then we ran into kind of all these technical challenges with scaling. And I feel like there's been some of these leaps and innovations, but to your point, we've really been stuck in solving technical problems for solving technical problems, and have really, I felt like, neglected the application side. And it's refreshing to kind of hear a team so focused on the applications that can ultimately be built and using the technology to further what can ultimately what type of applications can be built on top of the network, instead of focusing on solving some fancy math problem.
The value prop of Save versus a lot of the other sort of chains like Solana, like Aptos, like Sui, and other ones that people typically bring Say up against. It helps to take a huge step back and understand, like, what does it mean to be an open source blockchain? Like, who are the customers, the actual end users of an open source blockchain? The end customer that matters the most are the developers. And what do developers care about? They care about offering their users of their applications the best user experience. That's the only thing they care about, is acquiring users. You acquire users by offering a great user experience. And that is the only value prop, the only problem that Say needs to solve. That encompasses a ton of different technical feats. That includes parallelization. It includes using a lot of different development frameworks. So there are chains and there are blockchains today that their sole focus is, hey, we want to add parallelization. Their sole focus is, we want to grow a certain development framework or a certain coding language. All of that will be abstracted away. That should all be included in actually just solving the core problem. So if you properly solve this problem and offer developers the best kind of product and delight the customer, that means you abstract away the need to focus on a certain development language. You can write in Solidity, you can write in Rust, you can write in WebAssembly, you can write in Move. It doesn't matter. Because if I ask you today, what is the language that Amazon.com is coded in, or Google.com? Who knows? It doesn't matter. It's completely abstracted away. So at some point, the industry will get to that. And it makes no sense for us to really pigeonhole and focus on just that. That includes a lot of the performance pieces. It can include throughput, ZK, all of the things that a lot of teams are really focused on. But at the end of the day, the real goal is solving a customer need.
I fully agree. And as you mentioned, today that customer need is, especially on the infrastructure side, is the developers, and making that experience as kind of simplistic as possible so that they can build really amazing applications on top of the infrastructure. And I think, going back to one of my earlier questions, kind of why Say versus like these other ecosystems, that's one component, but also why from a developer point of view, or how are you kind of targeting the developer point of view and enticing engineers to build on Say versus the other options that they do have out there? Because I think that both of those, like, what is your unique value proposition, and then how do you actually get the engineers, are some of the most challenging parts for any new layer one or even layer two.
Yeah. No, that's sort of the sort of quintessential question. So I can speak on behalf of the foundation and share a couple of the experiences that they've gone through. Notoriously, the Say Foundation has always been very proud about being very limited with grants and being very limited, just kind of throwing out resources to teams. Because if you think of blockchains as infrastructure, so think of any example of infrastructure like Oracle, Snowflake. If Snowflake paid its customers to use Snowflake, the model just doesn't work. Like, you as a customer imply that you actually have to pay something. It doesn't actually work the other way around. It's not very sustainable. I'd say that's one of the big components, and that's proof that a lot of the builders and the developers that are in the Say ecosystem, they're not here because they think that they can get some short-term money and short-term capital. They're here because they're excited about the direction that Say is going at. And that gets me to really the core reason that I think the Say ecosystem has gotten a lot of developer interest. I think the team keeps it pretty real. That's probably the core reason. There's not going to be like a fluffy, oh, hey, here are kind of the 10 secrets. Here's the playbook. I'd say the Say Foundation keeps it very real. And what does that really mean if we unpack it? At the end of the day, developers and applications, they care about acquiring users.
Yep.
Yes, that means the infrastructure needs to be good so that they can offer a better user experience, but at the end of the day, help them acquire users. That's what the ecosystem should be doing. That's what the foundation should be doing, any other chain. And I think most chains don't tend to really understand that to its fullest extent. So a framework that I think about for user acquisition for any open source network is as a publisher.
Dive deeper into like different publishers and how that works.
Yeah. So for context on how to best understand publishers, by and large, I think a lot of people tend to view Web3 as this brand new paradigm. Things work differently. The projects work differently. User acquisition works differently. Businesses work differently. By and large, that's completely false. There's actually no difference between a lot of the things that really matter in Web3 and crypto and how things typically operate in gaming and in biotech. So we can bring up a couple examples. From very high level, biotech has major publishers. So if you look at the large pharma companies like Pfizer, like Merck, if the two of us were to create this brand new drug, we can't take it to market ourselves. We go to Pfizer, like a publisher. They'll take perhaps a percentage of future revenue, and they'll say, okay, we will bring you to all of the millions of sort of distribution points that we have, all the hospitals. Mm-hmm. So they become the central publisher of that industry. Same thing happens in gaming. If the two of us create this brand new game, this brand new storyline, we go to Activision, to EA, the publishers within the gaming industry. They'll get a deal done, and they will distribute us to the millions of sort of GameStops and everyone that's in their channel. Mm-hmm. The irony is crypto doesn't work any differently. So the question becomes, who are the publishers in crypto? And we think there's two types. The first are, go ahead.
I was just going to say those being.
Yeah. The first is centralized exchanges. So like Coinbase and Binance and all the classic list. And then the second are networks. So L1s, in the same category as L1s, you can think of as L2s. You can also add bridges to that, which are also effectively, all three are by and large competitors. They'll compete they all focus on the same kind of end customer. So those are the two types of big publishers. And if you look at just the case studies of how sort of early Solana, early Avalanche, early Phantom really played out, early BNB, you'll see a lot of these themes pop up. So what made Solana so successful as an alt L1 early on is because they partnered with a centralized exchange.
Yeah, it did help.
The ultimate.
Sam had pumped a lot of liquidity into Solana, and just by partnering with such a big name at a time, it really kind of gave Solana a boost, especially when the gas fees were much higher and kind of the Ethereum landscape. It opened a window of time where they could really kind of prosper.
Yeah. That's the right way to think about it. Like the ultimate publisher in Web3 today is Ethereum. So if the two of us, let's just say the two of us create a brand new protocol, new application, new lending app that we're excited about. Developers build on Ethereum because they think that Ethereum will help them get their first 10,000 users. That's what every startup should be focused on, not focused on scaling. Scaling is a sort of an honor. Like a lot of apps and teams in crypto make the mistake of focusing a ton on scaling early on, but they can only ever get 5 to 10 users. I mean, you just don't need to scale. That's not like a problem that you need to solve. Let's focus, take the kind of one step at a time. So every startup needs to focus on finding their first 10,000 users. Ethereum is the most attractive publisher. That's why so many developers, so many people kind of still, it has that network effect. The L2s sort of vampire and really pull off that as well. So they have this great advantage of just being closer to where the center is in terms of users and developers. So then for any alt L1, the question becomes, well, damn, how do you compete with that? How do you offer a piece of infrastructure and a product and an ecosystem that can compete with that of Ethereum's? Solana did an excellent job with that because they partnered with what was FTX at the time. The two of them combined became a competing publisher against Ethereum because Solana helped apps get their first 10,000 users, and then FTX will kind of step in and help them get their kind of next 100,000 million or so users.
And so do you think, I guess, over time, kind of the earlier iteration of blockchain networks like Ethereum or some of the networks that are more focused on technology instead of like these user problems will ultimately kind of become less relevant or less important over time if they're not able to continue to drive user adoption, or these publishers do not become as relevant because users are in ecosystems that solve their problems.
Yeah, it's a good question. The right layer one needs both. It needs to both offer great infrastructure that allows applications to have the best user experience for their users, whilst also supporting the right founders and the right applications in a way where they can help, they can serve as a publisher partner. So Say Foundation and any L1 foundation should view themselves as a publishing partner for all of the applications. Yeah, by and large, teams tend to over-index on one or the other, and usually very strong kind of technical advantages. But at the end of the day, Say is completely open source. Someone can, and several teams have already forked sort of Say in its current iteration. So at some point, that can only take you so far. It's the network effects of the ecosystem really end up kicking into play. And there's no better example than Ethereum. Like Ethereum is expensive, it's slow, it doesn't matter. Like literally does not matter. That's where still where most of the users are. Nothing matters way more than any of the sort of advantages that you can have a laundry list of the issues that Mainnet Ethereum has. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, when you do start to peel back some of the user metrics and the on-chain analytics, as you were saying, there's very few people that actually interact with applications on-chain. Most notably, the exchanges, as you mentioned, were by far the most interacted, whether that be in OpenSea of the world or Uniswap, and particularly focusing on simplifying that experience that leverages kind of the exchange of value on chain does seem rather brilliant. And I know you guys have been working on this for some time on the technical side with testnet and everything. Is there any like updates that you could provide on when you guys are ultimately shooting for mainnet and when people can actually expect to use Say in the wild?
Yeah. To piggyback off of the point you brought up earlier, I think that's what a lot of the teams building on Say really find refreshing is, for example, when the foundation talks to like a gaming team, a lot of the other L1s go to the gaming team and they come in saying, "Hey, we're custom built for gaming. We made a lot of the advantages that a game needs," which by and large is fluff. What does it mean to be optimized for NFTs? Candidly, nothing. It's not very compelling. It's purely marketing. The save focus never changes. It's always going to be optimizing for the exchange of digital assets. And a lot of teams sort of appreciate that kind of honesty, because you go to a gaming team and you go to them and say, "Hey, I'm going to be very honest. The open source blockchain is optimized for the exchange of assets." And then very next question that they'll ask is, "Okay, what the hell does this have to do with our game?" And it takes a bit of an educational process. Definitely takes a lot more handholding. But once the teams realize how important the exchange of assets is to their game, to their NFT, to their social app, that's when they really start building that level of conviction in Say. If you think about any game, what's critical to any Web3 game is the distribution of the gaming assets. So if we create a new game and there is this sort of token that's needed to play the game, or there's this token that needed to purchase assets in the game, the way that the game grows is by distributing the tokens as far and as wide as possible. That's why Axie is an example of a successful Web3 game. It's not necessarily because the gameplay is not fun. And there's many games that I'd rather play than Axie. It's because Axie did an excellent job distributing the digital assets. And how do you do that? Well, by exchanging them. You need all the sort of exchange venues. So that's why the focus for Say, it never changes, but it applies to every single application. What does the NFT project care about at the end of the day? They care about minting out the NFTs. They don't care about the sort of object ownership and the small little details. That's all icing on the cake. They care about people exchanging the NFTs and people owning them. That's it. So yeah, that's helped a lot in terms of helping projects really understand what matters for Say.
Yeah, again, like I really do think it takes a long time, I think, in general, to articulate really the first principles of what these ledgers are used for. But if you can really articulate that and focus on just that single core primitive of exchanging assets and making that as simplistic as possible, really building the entire tech stack from the ground up, it allows, as we've been talking about, a rather maniacal focus that just executes on one thing, and people can really self-select into utilizing that as efficiently as possible. And the beautiful thing is the blockchains really are kind of these exchanging of assets and tracking that. And so it maps to a lot of things rather well. And so you guys have been doing, you raise a good amount of money. You ultimately have built out a larger team with, say, labs and say foundation. You've been kind of operating on testnet, and I think now you're kind of approaching mainnet. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah. I'd say the last sort of 2 years has been just an all out sprint for our engineering team on really preparing, say for mainnet. In terms of the specifics on mainnet timing and launch, that's all handled by foundation. So I'll let them sort of comment on that. But I think the what I can say is the engineering team is effectively very, very close, like imminent in terms of preparing the chain and preparing the network and all of the stakeholders sort of involved there. The thing I'll mention about the big focus area for from foundation going forward, and what's going to matter the most to the ecosystem is it all comes down to the applications that are built on top of it. The infrastructure by itself is nothing without really, really compelling applications. The thing that gets me most excited is this concept, for lack of better words, of like a failed founder. I don't think there's anything more exciting than founders that have tried once, twice, three times, haven't seen that kind of success. They made a ton of mistakes, and they're looking forward to learning from that. Both because that's very much the sort of fabric that Jay, myself, and really the majority of our team is cut from. A lot of them are former founders. They've started their own projects with varying degrees of success, and some of them just complete embarrassing failures. I'm talking about myself particularly. It's like really, really excellent learning experiences. Maybe one way to put it. That kind of DNA is exactly what Say looks for in terms of some of the great founders and the apps that are building on top. Folks that have tried, they've learned, they understand how important it is to now listen to the customer and actually build things that people will use. Rather than just a really exciting problem that they're focused on solving. But that's kind of the big theme that Say is going to double down. And we were going to, and the foundation will give the most attention to are people who have tried before, and this is kind of their second shot. And they can roll with the punches.
And you guys will ultimately kind of be launching in a beautiful time. I would say, one, because it is, I would say, a bear market. And I would say historically, bull markets are, you really have to kind of be the loudest in the room to really get attention, because there's so many kind of competing things for eyeballs. But in the bear markets, you can really just focus on the core product, what you ultimately want to build, and what is the actual customer problem that you're solving. And then secondly, the ability now, I would say, to launch a new layer one when you have different teams, different founders. In the past, they may be on their second project, they may be on their third project, and be able to apply all the learnings that they had in those projects and really take it to a new ecosystems that is particularly optimized for one single use case, learn how to leverage that unique capability, apply it and all the other learnings from their past projects. Hopefully will create a brilliant mix of applications that can really springboard the Say ecosystem.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Like one of the big themes that I've at least come across as I get to know more and more founders is a lot of founders, they're building in an ecosystem because that's what they told VCs. That was your original pitch. It's like I pitched my initial investors in 2021, and I said, hey, we're going to be building this on optimism. And they are uncomfortable going to the VCs and saying, hey, so we're no longer going to build on optimism because we don't feel that that's the best infrastructure to build for the application that we're building. That's a hard conversation to have. The nice thing about a really bad market like this one is they don't have a choice. It's like the alternative is the startup just dies. And what I've seen more and more is founders by force have to take a big step back, look at their application from a first principles perspective, and ask themselves the honest question: what is the best infrastructure to build our application on? And by and large, that opens up the conversation for the foundation, for folks on Say, to really share with them kind of our thesis, and that's actually what kind of makes up, I'd say, a significant chunk of the ecosystem. Are people where by force they have to ask themselves the honest question, but that kind of opportunity you don't really get in a market where things are high flying. So it's exactly 100%. The point you brought up.
And I think, to that as well, I feel like you guys have, and the foundation has really done a great job of building kind of that community aspect even before Mainnet. I know you guys have a fairly large presence in the Bay, but also outside of the Bay in kind of more up and coming countries, whether that's hackathons, kind of getting people excited in different parts of the world. Can you kind of talk about some of the efforts that Foundations has really pushed to get a vibrant community and get the ecosystem kickstarted from a application kind of engineering point of view?
Yeah. I'd say a couple of the big points that Foundation has highlighted that I'd say perhaps makes Say a bit different in terms of their approach to community is first, the importance of simplicity, I think, really matters there. Like, a lot of the reasons why projects really struggle to build a strong community is their sort of message, their thesis, what they're all about is just too damn complex. It's not even complex in the way that perhaps you and I think of it as complex. It's just like more than a sentence. Yep. Like, you really need things to be simple for things to grow. The same will reflect across the largest brands. Like Nike, Nike's I think an excellent example. Does Nike ever talk about the benefits of the shoes, the sort of extra speed that it gives you? Do they ever talk about the performance benefits of wearing their shoe over Adidas? No, they only care about the sort of feeling that you get as an athlete, the feeling of winning. This is like all their branding kind of focuses on. So when people associate with Nike, they don't necessarily associate the benefits of the shoes. They just associate this sort of dream, the victory sort of mentality. I think there's a lot of learnings there. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So I think that's one big component, is that kind of simplicity about how we think about the problem, about what Say is solving. All of that can be abstracted away. Parallelism, ZK, all of that are components of solving the ultimate problem that I think users in the community really understands. The second is trust. Like, a lot of projects, they don't really trust the members of their community. And it's like, yeah, it's a bit nuanced. I think one of the effective ways that the foundation, or how they've thought about kind of the pros and cons of how other ecosystems have gone about scaling, is when you identify those few great members of the community, reward them well. Make sure that they are truly part of the team, and you give them that kind of agency, that kind of trust to just continue growing the ecosystem, to continue growing the community, and do it in the way that they want to. A lot of projects, they like having that control. I think part of it's just it's human nature. It's like you want to make sure that everyone's kind of doing the things that they should be. When in reality, the thing that's ultimately fulfilling for human beings is having that sort of agency to make a decision. So if someone in the community and Say is excited about doing this event in Thailand, do it. It's like it's their idea. That's what they're going to be most excited about. That's what they're going to be most passionate about. They're not going to be most passionate about whatever direction that you sort of tell them to step towards. So kind of hitting that right balance with agency, trusting the key people in the community that have shown themselves to really understand the Say value prop, to be passionate about exactly the problem that Say solving. I'd say that's probably the second component.
And do you feel like over time, just that trust within the community has spurred more hacker houses, kind of more organic development? And I guess for the rest of this year, once ultimately, say, is live on Mainnet, what are some things that you are looking forward to, or the community is kind of planning once you guys are live?
Yeah. The ultimate goal for any foundation is to be like Ethereum Foundation, where they really just focus on sort of doing research, and they don't really get involved in, because the community of Ethereum is so fervent that they just all of it's organic. I'd say that the same likely goes for how the Safe Foundation thinks about things as well. Is how do they get to that point? How do they incentivize? How do they give the right agency to the key people in each community globally to do this in the way that they want to? In terms of the sort of specific events, there are several great partners we have around the globe. Like in Silicon Valley, there's One Piece, just to name a few. They've run accelerators, hackathons, really focused on bringing over strong founders from like Berkeley, from Stanford, and a few others. There are several communities in Asia, which is just an area that I think the state community has just started really growing in a meaningful way. So capitalizing on a lot of the energy there, especially a lot of the users that they care about consumer apps. I'd say there's a lot more experimentation in consumer happening in Asia than there is in the United States. The US has historically always been basically like a graveyard for social apps because Facebook, Instagram has dominated so heavily that they've just choked a lot of great early stage consumer apps out. So Paparazzi is like a great example of one that was incredibly hot, had the spark in the pan, and then immediately died out. I think Snapchat's the only exception, at least in the United States. In Asia, the countries tend to be a lot more closed loops. So it's like Indonesia has like their own stack in terms of apps that people like using. That's maybe a bit different from Thailand, a bit different from Vietnam. So there's more opportunity to build, at least get a new social app started. So I think that's been a big area. And I think a lot of the hackathons that are getting held in Asia, probably ones that you'll see for 2049 for KBW will end up really being revolved around that.
Yeah. Very interesting. No, the community thing, I think, is vastly underrated, and the blockchains that ultimately are kind of able to survive the trough of disillusionment, I think, are really the ones that build that community, build that organic following, have some of the in-person events, and it's even better if the community is ultimately organizing those. I think it really kind of just shows the power of that community. But I guess, I mean, you can't talk specifically to when, say, we'll go live, but can you talk to what you're uniquely excited about in terms of either applications that are on testnet that you're excited to see go live, or maybe even more broadly, some things that you're excited about for the rest of this year in terms of the crypto market?
Yeah. I'd say that the thing that I'm personally most excited about, say, is Mainnet, is builders in the community really finally starting to realize exactly how important the exchange of assets is to their application. It's like one of the hardest parts about really articulating, say, early on, is the moment someone thinks about trading in the exchange of assets, they're like, oh, cool. Well, this is some good DeFi. I think the exchanges that all makes sense, and not really kind of missing the forest to the trees, and understanding, okay, for NFTs, for social, for gaming, the exchange of assets is just as critical to how those applications work as it is to DeFi. So if you look at the NFT industry, it revolves around OpenSea, Blur, and Magic Eden, other exchanges, where that's where people spend the majority of their time. So I think that's probably the thing that I'm most excited about. And if you unlock the exchange of assets, what are the other types of applications that you can really unlock? I think that is really, really interesting to really think about. So one example is, if you look at the NFT space, Blur took NFTs to its natural next step, which is making it even more exchangeable in trading based, where they effectively said, you know what, the photos, it's nice, the attributes, it's cool and all, but let's turn them into numbers. Okay, you're back to just exchanging NFTs as as they were numbers. How do you sort of continue to take that to its natural step? And that's why I personally think a lot of NFTs will end up really gravitating towards is what's the next natural step after what Blur did. I think you'll see a lot of that innovation happen on Say, and I'd say that's like a big focus for the foundation is how do you take NFTs to its next natural step in evolution.
And if you keep pushing that, what is, in your words, what do you feel like the end state is? Do you feel like it's everything's ultimately an order book and you can just kind of trade assets based on an order book? Or I'm curious where, if you kind of follow that logic, how the world ultimately looks.
Yeah. So Say Lives is not ironically an order book or an AMM maxi. Both mechanisms have their pros and cons. The only thing that Say is maxi on is just exchanging assets, and I'd say both are like just as critical in terms of making that vision happen. The point you had brought up in terms of kind of the end state, if you go back to the core value prop of blockchains and how where we view that headed towards is at the end of the day, a blockchain offers this permissionless, trustless ability to exchange some kind of digital asset 24/7 globally, like complete access. The benefits there, by and large, tend to be economic, but it is felt by every human being point blank because every person at the end of the day wants to just improve their livelihood. That's the only thing they care about. That's why they vote. That's what they end up going towards in terms of their political designation. They want to just improve their livelihood. They're very simple. It's not as sort of complex as I think a lot of the political science and the sociologists tend to think about it as. And if you live in a well-run country, it's pretty easy to forget and take things for granted. And I think a lot of people who end up living in countries like Venezuela, like Turkey, where they may not have as stable of a currency, for example, as the United States, South Korea, as other developed countries, that value prop of just a globally accessible 24/7 ability to exchange digital assets becomes that much more critical for them. Like that is like existential for a lot of folks that perhaps people living in just great systems don't quite appreciate.
I do agree. I think it's very easy, whether it's money, health, lots of things in life, to ultimately take those things for granted until one day you don't have them, and then you're much more appreciative of them. But no, it's I definitely agree. Well, maybe if we can kind of wrap up the podcast for I kind of like doing kind of like spicy takes. Are there any like ecosystems that you think are maybe worked well in the bull market, but aren't going to do as well long term, that either the like ecosystem projects, category of apps kind of only work in up markets, but don't work in down markets?
Yeah. It's a great question. So I think one of the most common mistakes that great, well-capitalized teams make, and specifically layer ones, is they forget that they're a startup. So this happens all the time for foundations. They start operating, they look at the token price and it's sitting at this, incredible, like huge valuation. And they sort of view themselves as a organization with that kind of valuation, which doesn't make sense. That's the valuation of the network. That's the valuation of the community. And that's not the valuation of how the actual foundation should operate at. So practically most L1s are actually Series A startups. They should have the same mentality as that of like a Series A seed startup, which means they should do things that don't scale. Just go back to like the YC sort of fundamentals.
I think that's beautiful. I mean, what along that lines, what other advice would you kind of give to builders and entrepreneurs in the space?
Yeah, I come from a very heavy Web2 background. And I think that there's a ton of advantages that in learnings that you can get from just case studies of what companies have done well and what they haven't. One of the on the topic of do things that don't scale, I think L1s like Solana have done an excellent job of that. Like after all this time, they continue to do hackathon after hackathon, kind of moving chairs, planning each one, making sure the lights look good. Just the tiny things like that. It doesn't scale, but that's exactly how Solana has built this incredible developer community that continues to stick around. You give each developer that sort of love and care that they deserve. A lot of L1s, like there's actually so many that it's I could just sit here listing them. They skip the startup phase and then just go straight to the foundation probably thinks of themselves as like a big large company now, so they'll go for the big announcements, the big partnerships that maybe bring in a total of like 10, 15 users to the network, and not focusing on the underdogs, the failed founders, the exact kind of place, and that's precisely where Say wants to double down, is find the underdogs, find the failed founders, and work with them as genuinely the best sort of publisher partner that they would need. And you know what? The big companies, they'll come. It's like once you win, they'll come.
Slowly, then all at once.
That's right. Yeah, that's well
Perfect.
said.
Awesome. Well, we touched upon a lot, Jeff. Really appreciate kind of a inside look into how you're thinking about things and also how Say Foundation is thinking about things. Really excited that Mainnet is really close to launch. I think everybody's kind of anxiously waiting to really get to experience Say on Mainnet, play around with it, see all the applications that have been building in testnet, and for those to finally go live as well. So I really wish you, the team, foundation, and labs all the best.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here, Logan. So thank you for having me.